In our last series, we had the opportunity to listen to a celebrated personality in Nepal's ornithology, Gharial Crocodile. Somebody whose knowledge and talent, whose work stays on top of every other ornithologist working in this country. But this time we have the pleasure of listening from a young researcher. This program is helping to fill up this knowledge gap and try to connect this different generation of people working ultimately for the good of conservation. So today with us to help on technical matters, Dr. Tulsi Subedi, who is a well-known raptor expert and director of Himalayan Nature. He's also with us. Thank you, Tulsi, for being with us. And without further delay, I would like to introduce our main guest for this evening, Phoebe Griffith. So Phoebe has always loved Nepal and has lived in this country for 8 years during her school days. It was during her stay in Nepal, she was inspired to become a conservationist by seeing the amazing diversity of Nepal's wildlife and a very rich cultural heritage. She learned about the respect and love to wildlife that every Nepali has in their heart and saw the hard-working Nepali conservationists working to protect the species, many species actually, particularly the gharial, which is on the verge of extinction. In particular, she was fascinated by the Gharial crocodile and the pioneering work of the late Dr. Tirthaman Maske. After training as a conservation biologist, Phoebe started her PhD studies in 2018, researching the critically threatened gharial in the Chitwan National Park. And using data from radio telemetry, direct observation, camera trapping, and local ecological knowledge, she's investigating the ecology of the gharial and the impact of conservation actions on this species. Phoebe is enrolled at the University of Oxford and Institute of Zoology, which is a part of Zoological Society of London. And also she is a research fellow at Himalayan Nature, a member of the IUCN SSC Crocodile Specialist Group, and co-director of the European Crocodile Network. Welcome, Phoebe, for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So if you, right, would like to say something, or I just end with the housekeeping rules?
Yes.
Would like to say something now, or shall I just end with the housekeeping rules?
Give the housekeeping rules.
Housekeeping rules. So I would just like to add some housekeeping rules here. If anybody has questions, Tulsi will kindly open up the chat options just before Phoebe's presentation is finished. So please do put your questions through the chat options and direct it to me. And we have, as you know, very limited time. I will try to pick up all your questions and pass it to Phoebe, and she'll try to answer to the level she can. But if we can't, entertain all the questions, please do understand, because we have limitation of the time. So Phoebe, now over to you.
Fantastic.
It's a hot England now, I think.
It is. It's trying its very best to be a little bit like the monsoon, but just not quite
right.
as. We're due thunderstorms later, so hopefully they won't stop the internet's help.
Yeah, don't steal too much of our monsoon, though. We need a lot of rain here.
Still too much.
Okay, Phoebe, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Ham. And thank you so much to Tulsi and Himalayan Nature for inviting me to speak on this series. I'm really excited to be here today. Now I'm going to try and share my screen. Hopefully, there we go. Brill. So yes, thank you so much for having me here today, and to everyone for tuning in to listen about Gharial and some of the work that I've been doing in Nepal and work done more broadly on gharial by my friends and colleagues in both Nepal and India. As Hem said, I'm a PhD student with the University of Oxford's Wild Crew, and also with ZSL's Institute of Zoology, and wonderfully supported by ZSL Nepal. And I'm very privileged to have recently become a fellow of Himalayan Nature, which is very exciting. And yeah, here's me holding the first ever gharial I held, which I'm staring at with love, because I really, really love gharial, which makes me the luckiest person in the world to be able to do the research that I do. And just first of all, I want to say a huge thank you to my partners in Nepal who support me and work with me on my research, without whom I wouldn't be able to do any of the work that I'm going to be able to talk about today. And to start talking about gharial conservation in Nepal, of course, the first thing that must be spoken about is the inspirational Dr. Chitwan National, whose work on gharial in the 1980s through to his untimely death was absolutely inspirational to me when I was younger, and still is to this day, because his thesis from 1989 is an amazing sort of bedrock from which all gharial research in Nepal now can build from, because it's such a wealth of information that lets us know what things were like then, and we can look at some ways that things might have changed to see the increased gharial population that there is today. But to really start, I'm going to go back even further to this, which is one of the oldest known images of a gharial. It's about 4,000 years old, and this comes from the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley. And I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but you can see this is a gharial with its gar on its snout, holding a fish in its jaw. And the gharial at this time seemed to be really important and possibly sacred animal, related to the river and maybe also to fertility. So there's been this relationship between humans and gharials for at least 4,000 years. And very tragically, in this part of the world today, the gharial is extinct. So what exactly is a gharial? Well, a gharial's a crocodilian, which is the group that encompasses crocodiles, alligators, caimans, and gharial. And they're distinctive because of this hugely recognizable long, thin snout. And the long, thin snout of the gharial, this is a female, so she doesn't have the gar or lump on the end, is all about catching fish. So they've got this really elongated snout, and the long snout improves the chance of catching fish, and then it's reduced narrowly because that's to reduce drag. Otherwise, if it was a long, thick snout like another crocodile, there would be too much drag for catching fish. And although they mostly eat fish, this isn't the only thing they eat. They do eat a range of different river creatures. In particular, this lovely photo taken by expert tracker Pankaj Kumar from the Chambal shows an adult male eating a very unfortunate soft-shell turtle, which is another one of my favorite animals. So it's a bit sad, but they do occasionally eat larger things. Alina Chowdhury, who's a young Nepalese conservationist I've been working with to interview local people about gharial, has actually got anecdotal reports of gharial taking ducks, but that seems about as big as they might very occasionally try and eat. And in fact, they're one of the only crocodiles where there's basically just no conflict with humans. There's no risk to people because they do really only eat these very small river creatures. Dr. Lala Singh, in his thesis on ecological studies of the gharial from 1978, I'm going to quote, because there's a kind of a lovely quote that sums up gharial's response to accidentally taking a human, which was that he knew of 2 people who were caught by gharial when fishing underwater, but released soon after as the reptile found them something other than fish. So they're really not a threatening species to humans, which as a gharial conservationist or among crocodile conservationists is quite a nice position to be in. And the thing is, they get really, really big. I had no idea when I was younger, because the gharial population in Nepal is recovering, I'd only seen quite small subadults, and I had no idea just how huge gharial can get. But this photo from the Chambal gives you just some idea of how huge they are. This white stick is a 1 meter stick. So it's showing just that they can get over 6 meters, probably bigger. And that this little yellow stick is how big they are when they are a hatchling. There's in fact a hatchling in the bottom right-hand corner. So it shows you just how far baby gharial have got to go when they're born before they become these kind of royal megafauna of the rivers of the Indian subcontinent. And even the females have got to get to a big size. So this is from our telemetry project, this photo. I will come back to talk about that a bit more later. But this is a 4 meter adult female we were about to tag. And in fact, females only mature over 3 meters. So they have to be quite big before they even start contributing and breeding. And so, yeah, this is the fantastic team I was working with for the telemetry project, particularly Assistant Conservation Officer Beb Bahadur Khadka, who's been working with gharial in Chitwan since many years. And then, of course, the big oddity about the gharial is the gara, which is this cartilaginous lump on the end of the male's snout. It's only on the adult males, and it's what their name comes from, the word gara meaning a type of earthenware pot in Hindi. And for many years, this has kind of been a big question of what exactly is the gara all about? Why does this crocodilian and no others have it? And our sort of best idea at the moment probably comes from the work being done by PhD student Jailab Dean on acoustic communication on the Chumbel. And he's been showing that the male gharials that have a gara are the only ones who can make a really distinctive noise called a pop. I'm going to give it a shot, see if one of his recordings will play through Zoom. Hopefully you could hear that. But what that is there's this really loud pop sound. Underwater, that was with a hydrophone, it sounds a bit like that. Out of the water, it kind of sounds like maybe a cork being, champagne cork being popped, or a large rock being thrown into the water. And it's this really loud noise that they use for communicating with other males, with females, with babies, and sometimes when there's a surprise on the shore, like a really annoying zoologist sort of wandering over to have a look at what they're doing. So the gara is probably some sort of amplifier for this really unusual noise. And the other thing about gharial, which they're becoming increasingly famous for, is being great parents. This photo is from the Rapti in Chitwan and shows a female who was guarding hatchlings from the nest of 10 different females. And as well as being great parents, they're also great alloparents, which is because the hatchlings they're guarding aren't always their own. So they've shown in the Chumbel that sometimes the males that are guarding the hatchlings are in fact the non-breeding males. And in fact, in Chitwan, we aren't sure which females are guarding the nests, and that's something we're looking into, whether it's the females who laid there that year. And this is another video also from the Chumbel, which shows just the one time of year that the gharial are aggressive is when they're defending their babies. So this is an adult female gharial seeing off a stork, which is a big predator of these little hatchlings, which are quite delicious to just about every potential predator you get in the rivers. So the parents have a big job on looking after all their babies. And of course, in the Chumbel, it's famous that these large adult males guard a lot of the hatchlings. However, in Nepal, we've seen this a lot less. We have been looking for the last 2 years now at 2 breeding sites, one on the Rapti River, which is a smaller river, and one on the big Naraini, the nesting sites near the Indian border. And we found the adult male in the Rapti doesn't seem to be involved in guarding. But the one on the Naraini is very occasionally involved, but the females seem to be taking the lead in Nepal. And yeah, this just shows the sort of sandbanks that the gharial choose to nest in, these huge, big sandbanks, and they lay communally. So lots of females laying in nests close by one another. And then either a dominant guardian male or a dominant guardian female. In Nepal, we found this seems to be the biggest female, along with a couple of other satellite females, will then defend the creche against any predators until the start of the monsoon, when the adults go off to feed and the hatchlings are then more on their own. And this is one of the sandbanks from Nepal, showing this communal nesting site where we've got all these eggshells from the hatchlings coming out. And then this is our remote sensing system. So we've been using video cameras to monitor the gharial here, particularly because at this site, they're really sensitive to humans, and direct observations aren't really possible. But I want to sort of draw back from gharial for a little bit to say, what exactly are gharial and why are they special among the crocodilians? So there are actually a lot of different species of crocodilian. It keeps changing at the moment, with new species being described with new genetic findings, but somewhere between 25 and 28. And we can see that there are a huge range of species, but it's the gharial that are really, really distinctive looking, with this unique snout. And so here's a very simplified evolutionary tree of how the crocodilians are related. So it's like a family tree for the crocodilians. You can see there's the groups of crocodiles are all closely related here, as shown by these short branches. And then their very distant cousins are the caimans and the alligators, mostly found in the Americas, which are closely related to each other. And then there's the group of the gharial, which are on their own branch here. And there's two species that are more closely related to each other, which is the Indian gharial, which is what we're talking about today, and something called Tomistoma, which is found in Southeast Asia. And they're also a very, very cool species. And so with ZSL have a program called the EDGE program, which is looking at why we should save a gharial. Well, why we should save or prioritize saving certain species in this world of sort of conservation prioritization is that gharial are really evolutionarily unique. If we're trying to think about this in terms of how closely related they are to crocodiles, it's millions of years. Gharial are as closely related to crocodiles as we humans are to lemurs. So if gharial were to go extinct, we would not only lose a species, but we'd lose this whole branch on the tree of life and all the evolutionary history that represents. So EDGE is a way of trying to quantify this in order to understand which species are really unique evolutionarily, but also really endangered. So the first step in that is what GE stands for, global endangerment. And that's the measure from the IUCN Red List, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, but if anyone hasn't, it's basically a scientific assessment to determine the risk of extinction of a species. And gharial fall in the critically endangered category. So they're at imminent risk of extinction. And the evolutionarily distinct category is basically how much evolutionary history does a species represent? How long is the branch they're on in the tree of life? So this tree here has a number of the crocodilian species on, and it shows how we've got all these crocodilian species fairly closely related to each other. These are the crocodiles and some of the West African crocodile species, which are more unique. Down here is some caiman species, and then just two alligator species. So there's just two gharial and two alligators. And if we then combine these measures, which is what EDGE does, to combine this endangerment and uniqueness, we can see that it's the Chinese alligator and gharial crocodilian that are really, really endangered, but also really, really unique. And so if we don't save these species, we're going to lose this whole branch on the tree of life, which would be a great tragedy. And actually at the moment, EDGE has a fellowship program for supporting young conservationists working on these species. And I have 3 friends and colleagues working on the gharial in India and Nepal at the moment. This is Jailab Dean, who I mentioned before, who's working on the chumbel, especially on acoustic communication. Ashish works on the babai in Bardia, and very excitingly last year documented that there was successful hatching of creches of gharial on the babai, which is great news. And this is Ranjana Bhatta, who is working on reproductive ecology and also acoustic communication in Chitwan. And I work very closely with Ranjana, and I'm afraid I didn't have a picture of both of us together because I think we're together so often. She takes pictures of me, I take those of her, and we're never in the same frame. So yeah, they're all working on gharial at the moment. So in terms of how has the Gharial critically endangered category been assigned to them? Well, we can see that Gharial should occur from the Indus in the west, all the way through the Gangetic Basin and the Brahmaputra Basin in the east, also the Mahanadi Brahmini system in north-central India, and possibly they also used to occur in rivers such as the Godavari, Indravati, and the Irrawaddy in Myanmar. However, since the 1940s, the populations absolutely crashed, and they now just occur in 14 widely spaced restricted localities in North India and lowland Nepal. And of these 14 widely spaced localities, only 5 have known regular reproduction and recruitment. And those are the Chambal, which is the largest Gharial population, which is here, Chitwan on the Indian-Nepal border, the Corbett National Park here. I hope, can everyone see, I'm not sure if everyone can see the cursor. And then the Chitwan population on the Nepal side of the border, and the related Gunduk population on the India side. And also, as I mentioned before, Ashish has recently found that the Babai population here is also breeding. So that's really exciting news. But yeah, these are very small, very isolated populations, which is very worrying in conservation terms, because one individual population could very easily slip away into extinction. And what the Red List assessment showed is that Gharial have seen exponential declines of 94% or more since the middle of the last century. And they now only occupy about 6% of the total river they used to live in before, as a optimistic assessment of how much river they still live in. And that these are only 14 very small localities. And of all those 14 populations, only one subpopulation, which is the National Chambal Sanctuary in India, has an open protected river habitat with an unobstructed river flow and more than 100 adults. So all the other populations have less than 100 adults and some form of barrier in the river flow. And in fact, the importance of the Chambal population internationally can't really be overstated, because that's 77% of all the Gharial in the world are found in this one sanctuary, and about 85% of total global nests are found there. But it's not always been this really positive story. The population in the Chambal, when all Gharial populations crashed, did also get very low. Also had to have a lot of conservation action. So it fills me with a lot of optimism that in the last few decades, the Chambal population has really recovered to hundreds of adults, and shows that we can certainly be successful in recovering Gharial populations in some areas to what they were before they declined. So why have Gharial populations declined? Of course, is a very important question. And the major threat, the major problem seems to be the building of dams and barrages. So obstructions to the river flow, they fragment Gharial populations, they alter the river hydrology. And essentially we can see that as dams and barrages have been built, the Gharial population has collapsed shortly afterwards. So that was seen in Nepal. Before the building of the Triveni barrage, there were huge populations of Gharial in the lower Narayani. After the building of the barrage, the populations got very low until there were just, I think it was 63 adults when Dr. Maskey began his work. And another related issue is water extraction. So industrial levels of water extraction, changing the river flow, can also dry out these deep river habitats that Gharial need year round to survive. Another threat, and one that is particularly important in Chitwan, is gill net fishing, using these gill nets made of artificial fibers. And they kill Gharial in one of two ways. One is they get entangled and drown, or get entangled from ghost nets, and over time they starve because these are artificial fibers and they don't biodegrade. Or the other is when fishermen accidentally entrap a Gharial in the net, they kill them in order to release them from the net, either because they're frightened of the Gharial, or perhaps they don't want to damage the net further. We're not really sure, but this fishing with these gill nets can be a real problem. This was when I was with Chitwan National Park staff, and they seized some illegal gill nets. This was from just one group of fishermen, so it shows the scale of the problem. And these are easily accessible nets, so it's a difficult issue. The other major threat, which is a problem across Asia for all freshwater conservation, is sand and gravel mining, which is gaining momentum and occurring at increasingly industrial scales. And as sand and gravel mining becomes on these huge industrial scales, it can cause a real problem for gharial, not just because it destroys the sandbanks they need for basking and nesting, but also can alter key factors of the entire river. And obviously this is a very difficult political issue at the same time, but one we're probably going to see more of when we think about gharial conservation into the future. So thinking of these threats and the current situation with gharial, how can science guide gharial conservation to help gharial recover and not just survive? So the way I'm going to talk about it for the rest of the session today is when we're approaching conservation through conservation science, we start with research questions and then follow scientific methods to try and answer them. So I'm going to give you some of our research questions, and these were developed because they had direct conservation importance. These questions were made through conversations with conservation managers and deciding what needed to be known in order to guide in situ gharial conservation, which is increasingly the focus for gharial conservation. So I'll start with some of the research questions that we're asking, and then look at how we're trying to or have answered them. So thinking of the in situ gharial population, a key question is, how much protected river do gharial need to thrive? How big do these protected areas of river need to be? And how much of the river does a single gharial use? When we do a survey and we find gharial upstream and downstream, are these individuals moving through that whole river stretch, or are they only using individual sections of the river? And also, how much do gharial use smaller tributary rivers? These often fall outside of national park protection, often because rivers make up the boundaries of national parks in many cases, such as in Chitwan. And therefore, if the gharial go into tributaries on the unprotected side, they may follow them outside the buffer zone and outside of protection. And the other big question was, how interconnected are different gharial hotspots on rivers within the same drainage? So in Chitwan, there's the Narayani and Rapti rivers, which are connected. And there are areas where all surveys for many years always find gharial. There are these places that are clearly great gharial habitat. But is it that the gharial are the same gharial each time in those hotspots, or are gharial moving regularly between these different preferred areas? And the way to answer this, all of these questions, is through radio telemetry of individual gharial. So this was first done by the Gharial Ecology project on the Chumbel in response to a mass die-off of gharial in 2007. And this shows one of the adult females they tagged and followed up. And you can see the attachment of these radios, and they were followed up by tracker Pankaj Kumar for many years, who's now a gharial expert. And what they found in the Chumbel is that these gharial are moving huge distances in the river. So they found the females would move over 100 kilometers downstream and then back upstream in 1 year to find nesting, breeding, and feeding sites. So they were using huge quantities of river. And so I was told this when I was first starting with the program in Nepal, and I thought, well, there just isn't that much river in Nepal. If gharial go too far north, it's too cold, and there's of course the barrage on the Indian-Nepal border. So how much of the river the gharial in Nepal using? And I just want to thank the Gharial Ecology project at this stage, as you will have seen, for letting me use so many of their photos and their findings, and the support they've given me and my team throughout our project. So now to Chitwan. Here's the awesome team that I was working with for the telemetry project. This is Santa Bia Aitaram and Ram from the Gharial Conservation Breeding Centre in Kasara, preparing to catch some resident gharial in order to answer these questions using radio telemetry. And these these guys are expert. They're from the Boti and Marji communities and know everything about the river and the gharial. And so the method we used to catch them was to set a long net around the basking sites, which entangled the gharial. And then you can see here, this Kale and Somla have throw nets, traditional throw nets that they then used to entrap the gharial. And we then very quickly removed the gharial from the river and took them onto the shore. And then this is the safest way to restrain a gharial. You keep weight on it and you keep them totally blindfolded. So the welfare is really, really important. So you're going to keep them as calm and as unstressed as possible. So we do this by blindfolding them with wet sacks to keep them cool and damp. And then we strap them to these ladders while we stuck the radios on the tail. So these is a GPS device and a VHF device that will enable us to track the gharial afterwards. And you can see here the wet sacks on the female. So this is an adult female tagged in our pilot study in 2018. And then as soon as the radios are attached, we release them straight back into the river where we caught them. So this is the process of releasing a sub-adult male. So we found in all cases the gharial went straight back into the river and resumed normal basking behavior, sometimes within about 10 minutes. And here again is one of the adult females who has bred this year, going back into the river. And then we've been following them up for the pilot animals tagged in 2018 for over a year, but for most of them just since last December. And what we found is a lot of them have been fairly sedentary, staying within about 20 kilometers. But actually, this map shows the route of one of the adult females we tagged in November last year. She was tagged up by Kasara on the right-hand side of the map. She traveled all the way down the Rapti River during the winter to stay here in the winter, which is a gharial hotspot. And then in the spring, she went all the way down the Naraini River to go and join a breeding group here in this very protected area called Velosi, where she mated and laid her eggs. So this is about a 40-kilometer journey. So we can see that some of the gharial are using quite a large amount of river. And this shows a slightly different trajectory. This is a sub-adult animal that spent all of the winter in the main Rapti River, and then during the monsoon went way up into one of these tributaries when it was in flood, and spent the whole monsoon in basically completely agricultural land in this small river, which we found some of the head-started animals were also doing. So they are using these tributary rivers outside of protected areas where, very unfortunately, this gharial ended up dying along with the other gharial that took up residence in this small river. Which suggests that a focus for conservation in the future might be looking at these tributary rivers that fall outside of immediate protection. The lower stretches are in community forests, which are really well protected. The community initiative means these rivers are absolutely great gharial habitat. And every year we're finding more and more gharial in these community rivers. But then in the monsoon, they seem to be moving outside of protection and putting themselves potentially at risk. This shows kind of the day-to-day of field work. The VHF radios have to be picked up manually by picking up the signal with this antenna, which is very good because it means that someone's on the river tracking the gharial, can see what else is going on and might be impacting gharial behavior and their choice of location. This is Prakash Basnet on the left, who's my amazing field assistant who does the majority of the tracking and is in fact still able to continue tracking at the moment while I'm stuck in the UK on lockdown. So he's absolutely brilliant. And I chose this photo particularly because this is Bishal, who's one of the game scouts who was previously in Chitwan, who was really interested in gharial research and conservation. So he came and Prakash taught him how to track. And it's the really, really great thing about being in Chitwan and doing this manual tracking is the huge enthusiasm and interest of young park staff and just young local people who are all so interested in what we're doing and in saving the gharial, which makes me really optimistic for the future. And then some other questions we realized we could answer after we'd put the tags on were the gharial that get their nets that are released entangled on their snouts. are they doomed without intervention? You know, are they going to starve, as we know some of them do in all cases? And also more broadly, after other forms of damage like losing their snout or a prolonged period of starvation, if they're rescued and re-released with the nets taken off, are these animals going to survive? And we found a mixture of results. Because of the individual tags, we're able to follow up specific animals to see how they respond. And luckily, we found that in most cases, but certainly not all, in most cases, they're able to get their snouts free of the net after a few days, which is really positive news, considering the amount of net entanglement we see. But that some of them certainly can't, and that becomes quite obvious as the animal's condition clearly starts to decline, and those ones will require rescuing. And then this photo on the left is from the Chumble, where they've shown through this tagging that gharial with chopped snouts can survive with sort of moderated feeding method, which is great, although whether they'll be reproductively successful is another question. And then on the right, this hook was one that the park staff at Chitwan removed from the throat of a gharial that was very, very emaciated, clearly not eaten in months. But because the gharial was tagged, we could follow it up and see how it survived. And it's still alive today, 6 months later. So that's really exciting. So to go back, I keep mentioning the Gharial Conservation Breeding Centre without explaining what that was. So the GCBC, as it's known, was founded in 1978 to promote and increase the gharial population, which had got down to only about 63 adults. And this is achieved mostly by collecting in eggs from the wild, rearing them up in captivity till they get to about 1.5 meters or above. And then they are boxed up and they have their scutes removed. So those are a particular cutting of the scutes on the tail means they can be permanently identified, which is how, for example, you may have seen on the news recently that a gharial from Chitwan was released and within 61 days found itself 1,000 kilometers downstream on the Hooghly River in India. And when they contacted Beb Bahadur Khadka, who runs the GCBC, he knew it was one of the gharial released from the centre because of this permanent marking method. They're then released in these pens, and after a few days, they break out through the pens and join the wild population. But what's been seen is that this hasn't had the big impact on increasing the population that might have been expected. So when it was initially investigated by Maskey, he estimated that only about 7% of the released gharial were making it and surviving in Nepal in that population. So something was happening to 93% of gharial. And in response to that, in the early 2000s, the program was shifted from releasing all the gharial into the Naraini into releasing them into the Rapti. And since then, the gharial population has increased rather impressively from about 40 individuals in 2006 to over 200 today. So there's certainly great increases, but even if we attribute all that increase to the Head Starting program, still something is happening to 70% of the released gharial and they're disappearing. So what's happening to 70% of the gharial released from the Head Starting programs? It's one of the key research questions. Are they dying? Are they being washed downstream over the dam to India? Also, how far are they moving from their release sites? This one that was recently found in the Hooghly River, 1,000 kilometers downstream, is that normal? Are many of them going that far? And does where they settle impact their chances of survival and of staying in Nepal or on the Upper Gandak? And also, what factors might affect this? So older animals or larger animals or sex differences. There are many questions about what might influence the survival of animals released from the program. So here we are at the GCBC, myself, Bed Khadka and Aitaram Bote, attaching a VHF radio, which was the smallest type of radio at the time, back in 2019, which we put these radios on 20 gharial that were then also cattle tagged and released from the GCBC alongside the cohort of 100 animals that was released that year. and we've been following them up ever since. And this map here shows their most recent known locations. So the red dot shows the release site in Kasra, and the green dots show the last known locations of the gharial. Unfortunately, for 25% of them, what that shows is the location where they died. So we found that at least 25% of the gharial died within 1 year of being released in Nepal. And the gharial that reached the Narayani before their first monsoon, the majority of them disappeared. It's again about 25% of the gharial, and we are not quite sure what happened to them, whether they ended up downstream in India, whether they were killed, but because of the high water, it was impossible to recover them. But about half of them are still alive and are still resident in Chitwan, which is great news. Some of them have moved upstream from the release site and settled there, some of them upstream in the Narayani, and we're now following them to see how they cope with their second monsoon. And what's also quite exciting is we know that one of them has settled just downstream in India. So many thanks to Dr. Samir Sinha and his team at the Wildlife Trust of India, especially Subrat Behera, who took this photo. They tracked our gharial on the other side of the border, and they showed that this one, at least, Gharial 08, has taken up residence on the Gandak just south of the border, which is further proof that some of these gharial from the Head Starting Programme are going to supplement the increasing population in the Gandak. Hopefully, in GPS, GSM technology is now at a suitable size that it would be small enough to put a waterproof tag, which was the issue, on a head started gharial. So that would hopefully be the next step in the future, GPS tagging these gharial to know for those ones that do cross over the border, how far are they going? And then the last few questions I want to look at very briefly are to do with reproductive ecology. So in Nepal, do female gharial nest every year? And if not, how often do they nest? In India, they're known to nest every year, and therefore it's a really useful technique for knowing exactly how many adult females you have in the population. You can count the nests. But in Nepal, it's not known if they nest every year, which also makes it difficult to predict how quickly they should be seeing natural recovery. But also, what is an adult gharial size? In India, they know they only seem to breed when females are above 3 meters and males are above 4.5 meters. There's been a big question about whether that's the case in Nepal or whether they might breed at a smaller size. And also, if gharial nests are left in the wild in Chitwan, what is the level of recruitment? So the Head Starting Programme, one of the main reasons it was initially started was because after the building of the Tribeni barrage, a lot of the nests were being flooded. So these hatchlings were never, ever making it. They were never even hatching. So if the nests are left in the wild, will they be flooded? And if they are hatching, then often with reptiles, over a number of years, you have essentially kind of like boom and bust years. So classically in reptiles, you get some years where a lot of hatchlings make it and become juveniles, and other years where very, very few do. So in order to know if there's recruitment going on from gharial nests in the wild, they need to be left in the wild and monitored for a number of years in a row. So this is in the downstream Narayani site, where we were setting up camera traps last year to monitor the gharial, if and how they were surviving and hatching, and how the adults were guarding them. This is my friend and colleague Ranjana, displaying the kind of the setup we have, which is these tripods with these video cameras attached, so we can monitor the gharial 24 hours without disturbing them by our own presence. And we were very, very excited to see almost all the nests hatched with at least some surviving gharial. We found in the Rapti that quite a lot of the nests were infertile, which may be related to the fact the male there is only 4 meters, but he is certainly the breeding male. Whereas downstream on the Narayani, where there's big adult males, there doesn't seem to be this infertility problem. And in both sites last year and again this year, although I'm sad to not be there, there's been these large numbers of hatchlings, over 100 at each site. And monitoring has shown that we've got these large adult females in Nepal doing the vast majority of the guarding. And then this shows a small adult female who was always downstream, keeping an eye on the stragglers. So these are two gharial that have drifted downstream, and so she's guarding them. So we, last year and this year, had 3 females at this site guarding the hatchlings. And then one of the big things that's happening at this site is there's a lot of interaction with muggers, which could be quite important. And the gharial responded to these very defensively, very aggressively. These were mugger females with their own creches, and most of them were seen off by the gharial adults, except for this mugger who wasn't having any of it. So that could be quite important, as the mugger is probably an important predator of small gharial. However, the muggers also do cause a lot of problems because they love to try and eat the camera traps. We usually manage to avoid this, but sadly this year one of the camera traps has in fact been eaten by a mugger, so they can be a little bit annoying. So what are the proposed, actually I'm just going to quickly go back before I go into that. In terms of the questions we were asking, we've seen now that through having known size tagged adult females or tagged animals that were 3 meters and above, and ones that were slightly below 3 meters, that the ones above 3 meters all bred this year and the smaller ones didn't, which suggests that 3 meters really is that critical size above which females start to breed. And certainly our female that was only just 3 meters was the smallest female we saw mating, which suggests this is the adult size. We've only had 1 adult female tagged for 2 breeding seasons, so hopefully we'll be able to answer the other questions after another year of monitoring. So proposed next steps in Chitwan, from my opinion, would be to continue monitoring to understand movement and survival in the gharial. As I just mentioned, to monitor the adults throughout 2 breeding and nesting seasons to get some idea of this regularity of breeding. Also, hopefully being able to GPS tag animals released from GCBC. This has been something that the team at GCBC have wanted to do for a long time, but the technology has only really just caught up, but hopefully we'll be ready by next year. And to me, for the future in gharial is going to be innovative uses of technology for accurate, reliable and cost-effective monitoring. In Nepal, especially in Chitwan, there's a huge push, especially the DMPWC and the national park, supporting these innovative uses of technology for conservation, which is really, really exciting, especially in tiger and rhino conservation. And we should certainly be doing the same in gharial. These GPS tags have been worked really well and given us really important and interesting information, and new technologies will be able to answer other questions, given that they're actually quite hard to study, given that they spend half the time underwater and move these big distances. And the shift is certainly more focusing on in situ and community conservation. So I've been very lucky to be part of the ongoing program, Community Conservation of Chitwan's National Parks, Freshwater Ecosystems and Gharial, which is looking at the conservation of gharial from a very holistic perspective, embracing local communities for both monitoring the gharial and also moving away from relying on fishing in the river. So it's a really exciting shift in gharial conservation towards this in situ approach. And my PhD has been implementing 9 of the action points that were identified from the DMPWC Gharial Conservation Action Plan. And I very much hope that the research that I've been doing with my colleagues and partners will be able to inform the next steps. The action plan is until 2022, and hopefully that these questions that have been answered will be able to inform what happens next. So what do question I'm asked quite a lot is, what do I think about the future for gharial in Chitwan? And I'm really optimistic. I think that Chitwan National Park is world leading in so much conservation, particularly in terms of tigers and rhinos. And we've seen since 2006, really big increases in the gharial population to over 200 animals that it is today. Although most of these are still sub-adults and juveniles, if we continue to focus on gharial conservation and it continues to be a priority in Nepal, I'm really optimistic that this population can recover to the levels it was in the past. I want to say that this wonderful, huge gharial that I tagged with this brilliant team last year is in fact the guardian female at the moment. And as we speak, she is guarding her hatchlings in the Rapti River, which is of course exciting for any conservationist. I'd like to very briefly say huge thank you to everyone, all the organizations who've supported my project and my PhD, and ask if there's any questions. I think I've overrun a little, so I apologize.
Thank you, Phoebe, for this wonderful presentation. You have given us a lot of wisdom with regard to the gharial conservation and the ongoing efforts and the problems and the future prospects. Thank you, Phoebe. And if you're ready, I will start taking some questions, for you. Are you ready, Phoebe? Your microphone is muted, I think.
Oh, is it?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Ready.
Yeah, now people can hear you. So the first question I pick up is from Professor Karan Shah, who is a herpetologist, well-known herpetologist of our country here. So his question is, being sympatric with mugger crocodile in almost all gharial habitats in Nepal, what do you think about sharing habitats with mugger crocodile is benefiting or harming the gharials?
So my personal view, based on both direct and indirect observations, is that the mugger crocodile is potentially harming the gharial population. Although both populations did get, in Chitwan, for example, very low in the early 90s, the mugger population has made a spectacularly fast comeback. And although large numbers of the mugger initially were in the sort of smaller lakes, there's now a really big population sharing the rivers with the gharial. And almost every time I'm making observations on basking gharial, if a mugger arrives, they drive off the smaller gharial, and the gharial are very, very wary of the mugger. And muggers certainly do kill and eat both hatchling and small gharial. And potentially because, although the larger gharial seem to be socially dominant, so when there's a big gharial, that's the one who definitely drives off any of the smaller mugger or any of the mugger, because the gharial do get bigger. There are just far, far fewer gharial. And something quite interesting I've been told about the babai is that since the mugger population really increased, the gharial population has not really increased in many years. And what's quite interesting is that when Ashish found that the gharial were breeding last year, there's still very, very few small gharial, which possibly it would be a really interesting thing to investigate, is if this very, very high mugger density is having a big impact on small gharial. And actually studies on alligators have shown that about 50% possibly of hatchlings are eaten by large adult alligators. So if the same is happening with this kind of sympatric two crocodilian species with small gharial being eaten by muggers, it's a really interesting question, but it is quite hard to investigate, but certainly worth looking at.
Yeah, that's a very good answer, Phoebe. If anybody has questions, I see a lot of questions already, but if you have any questions, audience, please do use the chat options and send those to me. And Phoebe, there are many questions, so be aware. You need to answer them. Okay. So it's the next is Shashank Paudel from Cornell University, USA. And his question is, does your analysis include any climate change scenario, as this species is understood as temperature-dependent species for sex determination? I think it had.
Yeah, so no, my work currently doesn't include any aspect related to climate change, although I know that the GCBC has been looking at using data loggers for monitoring the temperature of nests. But the temperature-dependent sex determination in gharials, so it's thought that this temperature-dependent sex determination in crocodilians as a whole evolved during a time of great climatic instability. So it would seem surprising if this wasn't a strategy that could cope with potentially changing climate, especially because gharial do exist across quite a range of different habitats. From they used to be in the Kali Gandaki in Nepal, which is quite a cool temperate zone, all the way down to parts of southern India, which are year-round very warm. So it would seem likely that there are ways of a lot of crocodilians behaviorally moderate the temperature of the nests they lay by laying at, say, different depths. And there seems to be this kind of plasticity there. So although it's certainly something that's very important to investigate and look at how this might be impacting the sex ratio, I think it would be surprising if it had a negative impact on gharial when they're laying their nests in situ. In terms of management, if nests are removed to a captivity situation, that might be much more important, because people will have to take account of changes and monitoring in temperature to make sure that that's not impacting the sex ratio.
Thank you, Phoebe. Again, I think it's quite many questions. So I think your answer will have to be also brief. Okay. If I may dictate that. So another question is from Suraj Baral, who is animal biologist. Although your study shows some amount of local connectivity, do you think it is enough to preserve the genetic diversity in the species? What would be the step to promote a regional connectivity among some of the subpopulations? So please have a brief answer.
And next, an important step for someone to take on would be looking at the genetics of the Nepal population and seeing how much genetic diversity there is today. That's being looked at in India, but not in Nepal right now. The difficulty are these dams and barrages that are actively separating the population. So in terms of promoting connectivity, I think the first step has to be to get the population to a level where it is already self-sustaining in terms of numbers of gharial. And then if there is a need for an introduction of gharial to promote genetic diversity, since these dams and barrages once built can't be taken away, then perhaps if there was enough males to support a strategy, perhaps in the future, it's probably quite a long way down the line, there could be the translocation of males, young males, to split them between the populations. So recently in Chitwan, a male was brought over from the Babai in order to increase the number of males in the Chitwan population. So hopefully, since he seems to be father to at least 7 nests this year and last year, that's already going to be promoting this diversity.
Thank you, Phoebe. Another question from Vivek Srestha. Do we have historical occurrence of gharials in Kosi Basin, Kosi Tapu in particular? Is there any scope for reintroduction in Kosi in terms of habitat suitability?
Yes, so historically they were in Kosi. This was probably historically one of their strong areas. They went extinct there pretty much, I believe, I think I'm right in saying by the 80s, and there have been attempts to reintroduce them. So gharial from Chitwan have been released quite regularly in the Kosi and mostly have not survived. I think that if they were, this habitat would certainly be suitable, but if they were moved, there would have to first be a big in situ conservation attempt to making sure the habitat is suitable. And if there's large levels of, say, gillnet fishing in that area, then the introduction of these small gharial, they're probably just not going to make it.
Thank you, Phoebe. Soumya Banerjee is asking, among the 50% of the GCBC gharials that were released and found to survive, were any patterns in times of size, sex, release location observed?
Yeah, so this is, I haven't done the sort of full analysis for it yet, but in terms of what we've seen is there were only 3 males in the cohort, because there are fewer males in the center. They've all survived, so that's good news for the male population. There doesn't seem to be a huge pattern in terms of the size or sex, with potentially some of the bigger animals seem to be more likely to move out of the system down to India. And some of the, and also our biggest ones were actually more likely to be caught in fishing nets. And in terms of release location, certainly since the shift to releasing on the Rapti, there has been a much better survival of the gharial. And we found for the gharial that are released, the ones that don't move as far downstream upon initial release are more likely to be alive and more likely to be still in Nepal after now 18 months. So potentially what this suggests is actually releasing further upstream in the Rapti might be a better way of enabling the animals to settle in the Rapti and then distribute into Narayani before they end up in this bigger river system where they could be washed downstream.
Okay, next question is from Marcus Cotton. And his question is, how can one increase involvement of the traditional fishing communities to support gharial conservation, monitoring, reporting, helping remove net entanglement, raising community awareness, etc. Basically, you know, their involvement for the conservation of gharials.
Yeah, I think this is really, really important. I think a huge issue seems to be that if gharial are entangled, the teams we work with, who are all from the Boki Marji communities, they will untangle the gharial and release them back into the river, as they've done with our project. I think if people were trained in how to release gharial from nets, it could be difficult, but I think that could be a potentially important way. And also educating and involving people to understand why these restrictions are in place for gill nets. People don't want to kill gharial. They just think this is a good and easy way of fishing. Whereas if people had social and economic incentives to avoid using these net types, that might perhaps be one way.
Thank you. Another question is from Dr. Narendra Pradhan. And his question is, for decades, we have been hearing that the gharial population of Nepal is somewhat stable due to various reasons. The population is mainly maintained because of released gharial. Any idea how can we cope up with this situation?
Yeah, so I think that for many years, a huge number of the nests were collected in from the wild. So the gharial population in Chitwan had very limited opportunity to self-sustain because almost all the nests were being removed to be raised in the GCBC. And I think certainly a priority in the future has to be leaving a larger proportion of nests in the wild, because naturally only a small percentage of wild-laid gharial eggs are going to make it to a larger size. But the more nests are in the wild, the more likely that is to happen. And I also think there has to be a real focus and investment in situ conservation. So protecting the rivers, avoiding these things that threaten the gharial, making sure that nesting sites are protected from disturbance. Because if these things don't happen, then of course it's very difficult to get recruited gharial into the population. So yeah, a real focus on in situ conservation, protecting nesting and breeding sites with the gharial eggs left there. And yeah, working with local communities to try and avoid this bycatch problem in fishing nets.
डाक्टर अमात्यलाई भनेको मैले हजुरले टाइप गर्नु न नभए केही प्रश्नहरू छ भने तपाईले त्यहाँ च्याट अप्सनमा गएर you can type it to me. Thank you Phoebe. So another question is any insights on diet composition of gharials in Chitwan? This is from Sandeep Luitel. Also, what about the present scenario of sex ratio, breeding adults in brackets, in wild population of Chitwan?
Yeah, so diet, we haven't really looked at specifically. It's just kind of these anecdotal observations of gharial seen eating mostly fish, and then we have seen a lot of these small gharial in particular eating very small fish, insects, crustaceans, and I think that one of the really important things is the small gharial need to eat small fish because that's all we see them eating, and so making sure that these fish breeding habitats are well protected is going to be really important for gharial conservation. And the second question, I've forgotten, what was the second question?
Also, what about the present scenario of sex ratio, breeding adults in wild population of Chitwan? So it's kind of a skewed sex ratio there, so I want to highlight there.
And so the skewed sex ratio, it seems to be getting better in terms of there are now 3 wild adult males and certainly at least 1 male that's just starting to mature. The issue seems to have been that the vast majority of the animals in the breeding centre are female, which is probably to do with the temperature of the eggs when they're kept and moved to the breeding centre. So of these head starts being released every year, sort of 90% of them are female. So just probabilistically, there just haven't been that many males. Also, there aren't very many adults in Chitwan at the moment. I want to really emphasise that. This is a mostly immature population. And with immature gharial, you can't tell if they're male or female. So certainly there are a lot of animals that in surveys we think are adult females because they look about 3 meters or just above, but are probably sub-adult males, particularly because we see this real mismatch between number of nests and number of what seem to be adult females. So there might be quite a few kind of just coming up, as you say, to become mature males. But I think that I personally think that this sex ratio issue would really be solved by leaving more nests in situ, because the gharial have evolved to lay their nests to get the right sex ratio. So if we leave the nests as they are laid by the females, then we should end up with a better, more balanced sex ratio.
Another one, short one, I think this one. Did you look into the effects of the effluents into the Naraini River from Mr. Top Khatri, UNEP?
Yes, no, we haven't. I haven't personally. However, I know that there's been a Nepalese master's student recently who's been working with ZSL, who has been looking at the water quality in the Naraini and had found that the water quality was fairly good. And we don't seem to see any issues with the gharial that suggests that they might be struggling or suffering from pollution, but this would be a really interesting thing to look into. I think one interesting way to do it would be after the eggs have hatched, you can, I believe, look at the toxin content in the discarded eggshells, which could be a really interesting project for the future.
Thank you, Phoebe. Another question from Saugat Bolake. I wonder why the gharial conservation has not been prioritized like some of the megafauna conservation, such as tigers and rhinoceros. Is it only in Nepal or worldwide? What's your thoughts, Phoebe?
I think it's worldwide. I think that crocodiles in particular, kind of like sharks, have been viewed as these horrible, scary, man-eating, ugly animals, and that in particular international conservation charities struggle to raise as much funds to support them. But I do think this is changing, and that's when things like nature documentaries are really important, because you can show people that gharial are actually great parents. Gharial and other crocodiles are super intelligent. And that when people realize this and embrace this, there's an increasing interest in gharial. And I've sometimes gone and given talks to school children in both Kathmandu and in London, and found the same response. At the beginning of the session, people are frightened. They don't like the idea of gharial. They say they wouldn't want to go near them. And by the end, they're like, oh, these are amazing. These are really cool. They're great parents. We should save them. And so I think that narrative is really important. And they're just, people think they're not as pretty as tigers, but I disagree.
Thank you, Phoebe. I will just bundle 2 or 3 questions from Amar Kumar and Vivek Shrestha about the effect of, what is the effect of gravel sand extraction to gharial population in your study sites. So maybe if you can give a short answer, then I will, Dr. Amatya, who is the former secretary, I think he wants to ask a question. So I will just give a special case for him and we'll unmute him and he can ask a question if he has. So Phoebe, just give a short answer to that, and I will invite Dr. Amatya just to put his question.
So the sand and gravel mining removes potential nesting sites from gharial. It's not so bad in Chitwan because it's not on a huge industrial scale, but in the Chumbel, entire nesting banks have been removed. And we have found that with the tagged gharial, when there's this sand and gravel mining, this seems to be a really big disturbance that drives the gharial away. And actually has been associated with when we've suddenly lost gharial. We don't know whether that means that something to do with the process has led to them dying, or whether it's just driven them away so quickly that we were then not able to find them afterwards. But also, when they've been doing this mining, it really changes, the water quality and the shape of the river in those areas, which can have other knock-on effects.
Thank you. Now I will ask Dr. Amatya to unmute your microphone.
One question.
Can
you hear me? One question.
Yes. Now.
Can you hear me?
Dr. Please. Yeah, we can hear you. Dr. Please be brief. And
okay, thank you very much, Phoebe. It was very, very nice hearing from you. Actually, I am not expert in gharial. Neither I know anything on wildlife. But what happened actually is that I was Director General of Department of National Park and Wildlife Conservation for more than 1.5 years. And then I had the opportunity to visit this Gharial Conservation Center. In the center, the people were raising small these hatchlings of this gharial, and they were feeding the small, the fish to them every day. They catch the fish, the live fish, and give it to them. Now, what happened that during the period that they are getting food, they could survive. Okay, but once they are released in Narayan River or somewhere rivers, and they died actually. Because we also did some what do I say, this when they died, they open it, their body, and there is no food at all. There is no food at all because our hatchlings, they don't know how to fish. So do you think that they need some training at the earlier stage?
Yes, I definitely think that's a really important point. I think that throughout most of the time they're in captivity. These days they're mostly fed dead fish, and feeding them live fish for probably at least the year before they're released would be really, really important, so that they are able to fish and don't starve when they're released. Certainly, we've seen the same thing with them becoming very thin, the tagged animals, after they've been released, that suggests they're struggling to learn to fish. And yeah, so feeding them live fish from an early age, and also potentially releasing them a bit younger. So in other species, it's been shown the longer they're kept in captivity, the more difficult it is for them to develop these behaviors. So if they were all released at a set age rather than a set size, that might mean they find it easier to adapt to being released. But I think that's a really, really important point, in making sure they're fed live fish in captivity for quite a long period before they're released would be pivotal in making more of them survive.
Thank you. Thank you, Phoebe. And thank you, Dr. Amate, for asking that very interesting question. And I will just, ask maybe one or two questions that are still there pending. So one question is from Professor Suvaratna Sakya. His question is there any specific fish species fed for gharial in captivity?
Oh, you know what? I'm not sure.
We'll have to do very short because we are running a bit out of time now. I think we'll have to close the session.
I'm sorry.
No, just you can answer that. And
yeah, I'm not sure which species they're fed in captivity. I know some work was done in Bardia to look at which fish species they preferred, but I'm not sure at the moment what they're being fed in Chitwan.
Narendra Pradhan, Dr. Narendra Pradhan, who did ask a question to you, he has just written and he's saying mostly tilapia nowadays. So if that is the right answer. What is the other question now? There is one question from Dipendra Adhikari, who is a wildlife biologist. Gharial introduction has been going on for quite some time now. What should we do differently so that species will come back strongly? I think some of that you did cover in your presentation already.
Yeah, I think definitely this shift to in situ conservation and in situ protection. Also, there's quite a large number of animals in the GCBC. So perhaps if there was a lower stocking density, so fewer animals in some of the ponds, they might grow faster. Could be.
Thank you, Phoebe. I think we have finished most of the questions. If I did not pick up some, and there are few still pending. I see Dr. Misra also, Dr. Hemantaraj Misra, who was the member secretary of the currently known NTNC, National Trust for Nature Conservation. Dr. Misra, do you have any questions? I will just give maybe 2 minutes if you want to ask. You will have to unmute your microphone. A very quick question for you, Dr. Misra. He hasn't unmuted. So thank you for joining, Dr. Misra. Yeah, thank you so much. So finally, I think this has been a wonderful session. Phoebe, I think you told us so many things about gharial. We have really started loving this species, more actually after listening to your presentation, especially the evolution tree and its specific habitat requirements you have told. So I think all of us, we have been highly full with knowledge, So thank you so much for the presentation, Phoebe, and on behalf of the organizers and audience, thanks to you for sharing your research results, and many thanks to audience for joining us in this presentation. And keep an eye for our next announcement. We'll be back with another presentation within a week or so. You can follow Himalayan NatureSpeaks to find out what's coming next. It will be very, very interesting topic coming also, another week. So for today, I would like to wish everybody goodbye and namaste. See you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.